When the great empire of the Romans fell in the west, it was the Visigoth who settled in Spain and established a kingdom. They were a race that had been nearly enslaved by the Romans, but they had risen up, grown in power, and rebelled. Along the way to their rise in power, they destroyed Roman armies, killed a Roman emperor, and in the year 410, they sacked Rome, something that hadn't been done, mind you, in 800 years. The Visigoths would eventually convert to Christianity and would persecute those not of their faith. But as far as power structure was concerned, they were the only game in town. Yet, even this sense of power was deceiving. By the early 8th century, as the Islamic conquest had come to the neighboring shores of North Africa, the Visigoths were in a dynastic struggle and were essentially emerging from a civil war. It was then that a King Roderick managed to claw his way to the top of the heap. But he wasn't destined to stay at the top for very long. In April of the year 711, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad led a force of perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 men into southern Spain. King Roderick, who was busy putting down a rebellion in the north, rushed down to engage him. The king stopped along the way to pick up some reinforcements from his countrymen, and the two armies met at the Battle of Guadalete. Now, on one side of the field, Tariq's men were disciplined and ready for a fight, and on the other side, Roderick's men were disloyal and rebellious. And when the king of the Visigoths rode into that battle, he was betrayed by his own vassals. When the dust settled from the Battle of Guadalete, the last king of the Visigoths was dead, and his army was destroyed. And with that, Visigoth Spain collapsed. Tariq ibn Ziyad and his Muslim army was soon to be heavily reinforced by his superior, the governor of Africa, a man named Musa ibn Nusayr, who basically didn't want to be left out on the spoils. And so the two men joined their forces and then led a rapid campaign of conquest. Arabs would call their new province Al-Andalus. Professor Catless eloquently describes what the new conquerors thought of this land: paradise. Al-Andalus was the furthest point west that the Muslim forces had reached. In the Arab imagination, it was a distant and exotic land, fertile and overflowing with wealth. End quote. By the year 720, nearly all of the Iberian Peninsula was under the control of the Caliphate. In fact, in the eternal quest for more money, the Muslim armies would even go off into France to raid for more plunder. But back in Hispania, the Muslims reigned supreme. That is, all except for a small sliver of land in the extreme north, which was protected by the Cantabrian mountain range. This last bastion, where the Christians were holding on by their fingernails, would eventually be known as the Kingdom of Asturias. The Kingdom of Asturias takes on an almost mythological presence, at least in the minds of the later Christian chroniclers. To them, she was the heir to the vaunted Visigoths, and it was here where the birth of the Reconquista was to begin. But it needs to be said that at this point in history, the Reconquista was very little to do with actual conquest and retaking of Muslim land, and much more to do with simply surviving. And this would be essentially its major goal for the next 300 years. Asturias became a rallying point for the refugees and for guerrilla fighters. You know, those who had fought for the Visigoth, and for those who would not succumb to Muslim rule. Amongst these who fled was a Visigoth nobleman. In some accounts, he was even the cousin to the fallen King Roderick. His name was Pelagius, or Peleo, and he managed to organize what was left of the fighting men of Hispania, and was credited with being the first to rise up against the Muslim horde and refuse them their annual tribute. This didn't go over very well, and the forces of Al-Andalus decided to pay him a visit in 718 or 722. Dates are not exactly precise, but the latter date appears more often. The Muslim army arrived near the city of Covadonga and demanded Pelagius' surrender, to which Don Peleo was recounted as saying, quote, "I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their authority. For we confide in the mercy of the Lord, that from this little hill that you see the salvation of Spain, and the army of the Gothic people will be restored. Hence, we spurn this multitude of pagans, and do not fear them." End quote. At which point, after saying this, at least according to the same historians, Pelayo rode forth and took on a Muslim army of 187,000 men, and defeated them, masterfully using the terrain of the high mountain passes. Not a bad bit of killing for one afternoon, if I can say so myself. The Battle of Covadonga would go on to mark the beginning of the Reconquest, and would become a symbol of Christian resistance to Islam. From this point onwards, Asturias would grow and become the precursor Christian kingdom. So it would come to be that for the next 50 years, she would cautiously expand along the Cantabrian mountain range and take over the northwestern portion of Hispania along the Atlantic coast. And by the year 775, under Alfonso I, Asturias would encompass the northern Duero River Valley. Alfonso II would firmly establish her as a kingdom, and in 789 made the city of Oviedo the capital. It was also during the time of Alfonso II that the bones of St. James or Santiago were discovered, and Santiago de Compostela would bloom into significance as a shrine and a pilgrimage route. In fact, this pilgrimage route would explode in popularity and in time would rival pilgrimages that were happening in the Holy Land. What can I tell you? They built a cathedral there and people came. And areas such as Galicia, Leon, and Castile began to get really repopulated. But this wasn't going to be the last miracle. Professor Catless gives us the riveting, if perhaps a little sarcastic, account of Asturias' rise in significance. Quote, "It was the year 844, as the story goes, and the army of Abd ar-Rahman II was arrayed on the south bank on the Ebro River at a place called Clavijo. This was in a region of northern Spain near Pamplona, which is now known as La Rioja. On the opposite bank, and much fewer in number, stood the ragtag forces of Ramiro, king of Asturias. The cruel Muslim prince, as the legend fancifully claimed, had marched north to punish the Christian king for his refusal to render the annual tribute of 100 virgin girls. Although outnumbered, Ramiro was confident his victory had been presaged in a dream. God was on his side. And as the Muslim host swept into his line, a heavenly figure appeared in the skies, a knight on a white horse who, together with the celestial army, turned the tide of battle and led Ramiro's forces to victory in the massacre of his foe. That figure was none other than St. James the Greater, who would eventually be called Matamoros, the Muslim killer, and would take on the role of patron saint in what would later be referred to as La Reconquista." End quote. Asturias now had land, a capital, a growing population, waterfront real estate, and a patron saint to top it all off. And this wasn't any ordinary saint, but St. James, Matamoros himself. This was a figure that later crusading orders would be named after. Crusading orders that would have mottos like Rubet and Cis Sanguine Arabum, may the sword run red with the blood of the Arab. Despite the ongoing raids from Al-Andalus, things were going pretty well for Asturias up until about the year 910. This was the year that the king, who was now Alfonso III, was forced by his own family at gunpoint, or I should say sword point, to abdicate the throne and divide Asturias into three parts. Of which, in the year 924, one of the newer states, Leon, managed to conquer the other two and establish the Kingdom of Leon. The Reconquista was beginning to warm up, but if you read Sun Tzu, he'll tell you that the first thing you need to do is establish a justifiable cause for fighting. And again, having a super powerful militant saint like Santiago Matamoros helps this along nicely. Catless goes into the method of how the historians of that time galvanized the people and established the justification for the Reconquest. Quote, "The histories from the era of Alfonso III and those composed in the 11th century and later were written by foreign clergymen who had an explicit commitment to supporting the political supremacy of the Leonese monarchy in order to frame the history of Spain in terms of the grand Christian-Muslim conflict. These histories conceived of the world in terms of celestial struggle. Their language was biblical and their rhetoric apocalyptic. For them, the Christians of Spain were the true Israel, a people chosen by God but cast down for their disobedience and sin, and who were now called on to reclaim their rightful place through inner piety and earthly battle against the infidel. The history of Leon dates back to Roman times. The city was founded as a military outpost by the Roman Legio Septima Gemina. As such, she had city walls and fortifications and made a natural fort base, not to mention a good capital. She was incorporated into Asturias in 742, but as mentioned became a state of her own when Asturias was partitioned. Now it would be under her new and somewhat belligerent king, Ordoño II, that she would fight and eventually overrun her Christian neighbors, and thus unify northwestern Spain. But it wasn't going to be until 931, under Ramiro II, that Leon began to really rise to prominence. Ramiro II pushed her borders east, nearly to the Pyrenees, and took the city of Burgos and the surrounding land. This land would soon be known as the County of Castile. Much more on that in just a little bit. Ramiro was a prominent military figure, and the people of Al-Andalus would affectionately refer to him as the Devil. You see, it was under his administration that he went toe-to-toe with the Muslims of the south. In 939, the Emir, now Caliph of Cordoba, led a massive army into the north to teach the Christian kingdoms a lesson. This Caliph was none other than Abd al-Rahman III, one of the greatest rulers of Al-Andalus, and at the time was riding high on his military successes. In fact, he was so confident that he was leading his own men personally on campaign. Abd al-Rahman III had unified most of Al-Andalus at this point and had been victorious during his famous Muez campaign about 20 years earlier. It was during this campaign that he not only torched Pamplona, but also wrecked the combined forces of Leon and Navarre. He was now in the north to essentially finish the job. But Ramiro II was not one to be pushed over very easily. He set up an ambush, and the Caliph, who felt a little too secure in his supremacy, in fact, he even called his campaign omnipotence, rode right into the trap. At the Battle of Simancas in 939, the Leonese king destroyed the Muslim army and came within a hair's breadth of killing the Caliph himself. It was due to victories like this that Leon was able to expand. She now encompassed the southern portion of the Duero River Valley. Again, it was a bit of a wasteland, but whichever way you look at it, the border between Cross and Crescent was moving south, and in the process, the lands of Al-Andalus had been diminished. However, that all said, the Reconquista was then going to be put on hold for the next 100 years. When the usurper Al-Mansur took control of the Cordoban government, he only intensified the strength of the army and brought Al-Andalus to the pinnacle of her military prowess. During his reign, he led over 50 campaigns. In 985, he left Barcelona a burning pile of rubble, and in 997, he breached the sanctity of Santiago de Compostela deep within Galicia. While he was there, he demolished her cathedral and stole the sacred shrine's bells. As Professor Catless masterfully puts it in his book, the caliphate at this point held the Christian kingdoms by the bell. It was time now for the Christian kingdoms to rise to predominance once again. And in the northeastern part of the peninsula, a small Christian enclave would seek her destiny.